All right. Thank you for tuning into the Mike on Mike show. If you're watching on Facebook, please go to the Mike on Mike podcast page and like and follow that page. That really helps you to get the latest content, and it also helps me to grow the platform a little bit here. If you're watching on YouTube, please like and subscribe to that channel for the same reasons. If you live in Josephine County and in Grants Pass specifically, you're no stranger to this topic that we're going to cover. It has to do with the homeless issue and all of the controversy which has transpired since the Supreme Court case, which took place around 2020 or thereabouts. Joining me today, Mike Pelfrey. Hey, Mike Pelfrey.
Hey, Mike. So it's actually Mike on Mike today.
Yes, it is. So you're a regular at basically any meeting having to do with this topic, whether it is in the county or the city council. And you've been very outspoken, to say the least, sometimes in a way that grates people the wrong way. Would you agree with that?
I would absolutely agree with that. You know, when you have a passion for your community, sometimes things come across a little bit different. I have a little different style of delivering some messages or topics, and it's just the passion in me that comes out.
There isn't any question that how you feel about this topic probably has a lot to do with how close you are to it. If it's happening in your neighborhood, as it is with many people that live near the parks, or near this new, the expansion on the A Street camp, you probably feel pretty strongly, and your emotions are right under the skin there, I'd say.
You know, you hit the nail on the head, because when we moved to Grants Pass, we had a vision of living in a small town and being able to ride our bikes into town, whether it's happy hour or to a restaurant or what have you. And we ended up living pretty close to, or really right behind Reinhardt Park along the river, but we're directly across the river from Tussing Park. And Tussing Park, as we all know, is a hotbed for the homeless, I'll just say the homeless population, to set up camp. And we are literally on the front lines of the things that take place across from the river. It's amazing the things that you can hear at 2 o'clock in the morning when you're trying to enjoy a night of good sleeping. And we have wonderful weather where you can leave your door cracked, but it's a shame that you have to hear what's happening across the river. And, you know, I just have to tell you that this is not what I had envisioned when I bought my house, and I'm sure my neighbors feel the same way.
Yeah. We know somebody who lives very, very close to Tussing Park. David Dapper, people will know him from meetings as well. And he is literally right there. He has to deal with these people on a regular basis. And so he's pretty emotional about it. And, after years of having to deal with it, and then when they opened the J Street camp and they moved people out of the parks, nobody's happier than David Dapper at that point. You know, he's thinking, "Oh, this is fantastic." But then, I mean, it has to, since they have returned to Tussing Park, it has to occur to him that, and other people, that it doesn't really matter where in the city this is taking place. It's degrading the city for all of us.
Yes. Well, again, it's unfortunate that we live in a city that we don't have a lot of wiggle room in this city, meaning that Grants Pass is only, you can only go so far, and next thing you know, you're in the county. So in my opinion, it's impossible to go anywhere along the streets of the city of Grants Pass and not have some encounter with some type of homeless person, whether it's a camp or a person just walking along the street. You know, we just got back on a 17-state trip, RV trip, and I will tell you that we did not see anything remotely like this until we got back to Grants Pass. And as I'm turning, you know, I was telling my wife, we're turn left, turn right, go straight. And I said, do you notice that every single direction that we just went to get to our house, there was a homeless person somewhere along that route? And that is not a sustainable vision that this city needs to find itself in, because if not, we're going to, well, I'll just say it this way. I think Grants Pass is slowly dying. They just don't know it yet. And unless we get a hold of this issue, and we need to get a hold of it now, we may not recover from it. So I pray that we'll be able to, our leaders will get together, get their heads together, but they're not going to be able to do any of this without the input from the citizens. And I hope that we can all get on the same page. But I also want to bring the county into this as well, because last time I checked, Grants Pass is the county seat for Josephine County. So, yeah, you're right.
Yeah. It's pretty clear that, you know, many people will watch this video outside of this area and not have a total understanding of it as we do. But I think that no matter where you are, if you are paying attention to the homelessness issue, you understand that homeless is a term that gets applied as a blanket over everyone who does not have a home. Now, there is a distinct difference between types of homeless people. And this is not a new topic here locally. Most everybody, if I said that, they could finish the sentence for me. They know what we're talking about. But the reality is that if you're talking about nonprofits, the homeless industrial complex, they describe homeless people as one monolithic thing. Mm-hmm. And whether you fit the Marion Joseph profile of the, you know, poor people who couldn't find a room at the inn, or you're a drug addict and the worst kind of violent criminal, you're all the same.
Yes.
In the homelessness thing. So if you would describe the population of homeless people in Grants Pass, and you didn't have homeless as a term, how would you describe it?
Well, I mean, this actually is something that I've put a lot of thought into, because what I see is that they keep, and as you know, our government doesn't want to use the word homeless. They want to use, or at least Oregon doesn't want to use the word homeless. They want to use the word unhoused. And you are correct. There are a lot of people out there in our community that we can see that are unhoused. However, not all of those people that are unhoused are, I'll just say this, they're not the most upstanding citizens that we could want into our community. You know, I posted something the other day that I basically said that if you came to Grants Pass homeless, I would kindly ask that you leave. And the reason for that is that person or individual chose to come here as a homeless person. They weren't coming here to look for a job. They weren't coming here to look for a house. They were coming here to add to the unhoused population that we have going on. And it's not our city's responsibility. It's not the taxpayers' responsibility to have to look after and help this person. They came here already as a burden, not only to themselves, but to our community. But when you go into these camps, whether it's a camp or a park or what have you, there are all walks of life inside these parks. There are people that are truly homeless. And I have been preaching from day one that we need to go out, and I think that the two entities within our city that has the biggest grasp on this would be, number one, law enforcement, because they're on the front lines. They know who the troublemakers are in this city. And then number two, you have the so-called nonprofits. And if the nonprofits are doing their job and they're out on the ground, they too should know who truly needs help, and then who's taking advantage of the system and our community. So, I would love...
But there's a conflict
there.
As I see it, there's a conflict of interest, perhaps, I'm assuming that the money that comes into these nonprofits comes in on the basis of numbers. It has to. Come in on the basis of the numbers of the people who they are ostensibly serving.
Yes, of course.
So if you did something, if you categorized them in a way that changed the way enforcement happened, and you had a robust enforcement against the breaking of laws, like if somebody is using illegal drugs and you arrested them and put them in jail and prosecuted them, the numbers would go down.
Well, they would go down, but the key part of that is the prosecution part.
Right.
And right now, what we have is a revolving door, because, law enforcement, let's just say they walk up and see someone that's doing something that they shouldn't be doing, and it's an arrestable offense. Within, I don't know, maybe 24 to 48 hours, that person is back on the streets only to repeat the same behavior. I find it almost crazy the way the city treat someone when they go into, and let's just use a park, for example. So if someone's in a park and they're doing something that they shouldn't be doing in that park, they get they get trespassed. But guess what? They get trespassed from that park. They don't get trespassed from the entire park system, which is what they should be getting.
Yeah, I agree.
And then, I actually posed a question yesterday during the Listen and Learn. And my question was that, if our law enforcement knows the troublemakers, the vagrants, the people that are here that, yes, they might fall under the umbrella of being unhoused or homeless, but they have zero desire. I call them career homeless or career vagrants. Their sole purpose is to basically take advantage of the system and take advantage of the taxpayers within our city. And so why can't the law enforcement, if you have the ability to trespass someone from a park, why can't you trespass them from our city? That's just a thought.
Yeah, I understand. And there's a problem with the enforcement side of this. And some of it has to do with the willingness on the part of the state to back up this type of enforcement. As I understand it, and correct me if I'm wrong on any of these points, but during the the early part of this, when the lawsuit was underway and the injunction was underway, and the Supreme Court case was churning along, I think that the state understood that this was a loser, that they were going to lose at the Supreme Court. I think that they understood that, and they wanted to head that off so that they could continue the forced accommodation of the unhoused in Grants Pass and in every other city in Oregon. And so they passed HB3115. And there was a meeting last night at the city council to discuss the idiosyncrasies of HB3115 and what the city had to do to comply with it. Now, I'm of the belief that the state really wants to apply whatever pressure that they possibly can to us to head off us returning the city autonomy, and control of the homeless population in the city of Grants Pass. They want to head that off, and they want to keep the current model in place. The reasons for that I can speculate on, but I have no knowledge that it's the case. Some, I believe that they are in cooperation, shall we say, with the nonprofits, and there is a funding loop that takes place in much of this situation. This is my speculation on it. But you can confirm some of these things by going to datarepublican.com, entering the employer ID number of the nonprofit in question, and it will trace the funding stream all the way back to its source. And entities like Disability Rights Oregon, they go all the way back to the source that we all understand. It's all federal or state money that is being funneled to them. And then, so I'm speculating that there's a bit of a conflict of interest on the part of the state, because much of this money, these nonprofits are being run by friends of theirs, personally, probably, and politically, certainly. And that some of that money gets looped back into, Democratic Party donations and things of this nature. So, in the city of Grants Pass, in Josephine County, the DA is primarily gets its dictates from the state. They have a prosecution agenda that is heavily dictated by state rules. And I tend to think that the city police department doesn't want to buck that system. And that may be a little bit controversial for you. What's your input on that? Well,
so that's a lot to chew on, but I will say that going back to your initial thoughts about the fact that HB3115 pretty much was something that was put in place to I'll just say, to keep Oregon in the homeless game. I've always said, and I will continue to say, that the money, when it comes to the homeless problem, just like even in the medical world, the money is not in the solution. It's in the disease and it's in the problem. And, we have a ton of these nonprofits, and if they were all absolutely doing their job to the best of their ability for all the right reasons, they should run themselves out of business. But we all know that that's not the case. And so, I look at the state of Oregon and the way they approach homelessness. It feels as if our state and cities like Grants Pass are a proving ground, meaning that they're going to throw the craziest bills or the craziest restrictions on these cities, and they're going to sit, and they're going to sit back and watch and see what works and what doesn't work. And again, that's where the proving ground part comes in. And I think that when they talk about, and this is the one term that just drives me nuts, and that is objectively reasonable. Well, I can just say that. Thank you for getting that correct. There's so many people that that use that phrase publicly that totally murder it. And you know what? You need to understand what it means. Look up objectively reasonable. In short, objectively reasonable is different depending on who you are and what you think about certain political topics, or where you are. Well, I think objectively reasonable is a two-way street, meaning if the state feels that we need to treat the homeless crisis in an objectively reasonable way, we as citizens, we as a city also deserve the same respect. Is it objectively reasonable for our city to have 4 encampments in the middle of our city, knowing that a city like Grants Pass thrives on tourism? You cannot, if you get off of any exit, I don't care if it's the first exit or the second exit, and you turn down those streets heading into the center of our city, just look to your left and right, and what you're going to see is you're going to see the discarded shopping cart with garbage in it. You're going to see closed down businesses in every direction. That's not counting what's in the middle of downtown. I went, took a walk last week, and I can tell you that there is quite a few for rent, for lease signs hanging up. Well, there's a reason for that. And I'm guessing that reason is where we find ourselves as a city when it comes to the homeless crisis that we're in. And what gets me is that the state has declared this an emergency in the state of Oregon, but it's only an emergency for cities like Grants Pass. Where is the state's involvement? And in my opinion, it would be objectively reasonable to transfer this risk or transfer I'll just say the crisis back to the state rather than relying on small cities like ours to try to do something when, number one, we can't afford to do it. Last time I checked, the state hasn't come down here and written some large checks so that we can put these folks up or we can find some type of help. No, what they're doing is they're pushing this back on the city. And of course, the city is looking to try to do something, but there's only so much space in our city. So, anywhere we choose to put a camp or anywhere we choose to put a shelter is going to get some type of drawback from the community. We saw that leading up to, I'll just say that under our last administration here in Grants Pass, everything that they tried was kicked back by the community. And so this is not going to be an easy fix, but I personally feel that we should push this back to the state. I've mentioned a couple of times that, and I think to me that's probably the best idea that I've heard of, and that is, why doesn't the state, knowing that they have a ton of state parks all over this state, we have one right south of Grants Pass, Valley of the Rogue State Park. It checks off every single block that they are requiring the city of Grants Pass to do. It has 90 places for RVs to park. That gets every RV off of the street. It connects them to power, water, and sewer. It has restroom facilities. It is ADA compliant. It's not next to a neighborhood. It's not next to a school. You can't tell me that they can't somehow figure out bus service so that the homeless population can get to their medical appointments. And then the other thing that I love is the fact that every nonprofit has one place to go. And for the drug addicts in that community, it's also one place where drugs can be acquired. So that shouldn't be difficult for law enforcement to key in on rather than having them spread out all over this city. So there are solutions. We just have to have the will and the guts and the backbone to do them.
It sounds like that you're talking about, well, there's a couple of things going on in what you just said. One is that the state, listen, there is a social contract that we have unspoken with the county that we live in, with the state that we live in, with the country that we live in, that when you pay property taxes, there's a certain benefit to that. And it's public safety, primarily. In some cases, it's, water and sewer services, things of this nature. And we pay a certain amount of money for that. But what isn't referred to often is quiet enjoyment of our own property. That's part of what we're paying for. And we're not getting that now. And we would have it if enforcement were allowed. And the only thing that is stopping the enforcement is the state law that forces us to be subject to the unhoused, which are primarily, depending on who you talk to. Well, there was a Dr. Phil episode here that one of our locals, Brock Spurgeon, was on, and they were talking about the homeless situation in Grants Pass, and they suggested, because there was a study that determined that 78% of the unhoused were drug addicted. I have used that number in talking to a number of people here locally, and they suggest, and these are people that have regular contact with the unhoused, and they suggest that number is probably quite a bit higher. And part of the reasoning I have to believe for that is that if you are unhoused in Grants Pass, and you've got a lot of unhoused buddies in different places, and the services are, amenable to easy living, you're going to spread the word about that. And perhaps that ratio of the unfortunate homeless to the drug addicted unhoused changes.
Well, I can just tell you that the state of Oregon didn't do us any favors when they decriminalized hard drugs. And basically that was literally hanging a welcome mat in front of every entrance into the state of Oregon for those that are living that lifestyle, whether it be they're homeless or they just enjoy doing the type of drugs that they were doing. So they were inviting these folks into our state for the simple purpose that they knew that they would be treated much differently than, say, Maricopa County down in Arizona. They treat things just a little bit differently than we do here. And it's pretty sad that our state, because of this type of legislation, they take absolutely no responsibility in any of this whatsoever, because if they did, then the state would do more to help cities like Grants Pass. Our weather, just like the sign says, it's the climate. Well, if you're a homeless person and you're looking to go somewhere, and let's just say climate is an important part of your selection, Grants Pass is on that map. And then you add to the fact that you can do your drugs and pretty much be uninhibited by law enforcement, or know that, these folks don't care about their credit history. They don't care about whether they miss a payment or any of the things that normal citizens are responsible citizens are doing. What they look at is that when they do get arrested, it's pretty much an opportunity to go get a shower and 3 meals, and they get ready to go back and do that same behavior all over again. So law enforcement in Grants Pass, and I'm not pointing any fingers, I know that unfortunately they're having to do this in a very unique, and I'll just say, I personally just not sugarcoat it, in a very twisted state. Law enforcement in the state of Grants Pass is really a very difficult job, and I feel for these folks, but at the same time, it's frustrating as a citizen, because as a citizen, you expect your law enforcement to come in and pick up the bad guy and take them away, and hopefully they learn their lesson. But instead, it really is nothing more than a turnstile, and they just continue to repeat this behavior over and over again.
So leadership on some level is affecting this. There is not a will to enforce. Now, whether that's happening on a local level, I almost kind of doubt it. I have to believe that that's somewhere outside of here. But you may have people in the enforcement, bureaucracy here that just feel like being hard on the homeless would somehow make them look bad or something. I noticed one of the elements in the meeting there last night was try not to appear as though you somehow are biased against the unhoused. And, it's kind of hard to do that because I am very biased against criminal drug addicts, and I'm sorry, that doesn't make me a bad person because I'm biased against that. I am also biased for a peaceful environment, and the injection of these people into that peaceful environment destroys the peace of that environment. So, I'm sorry. I understand that they want to have that image for themselves. That's going to be very hard for them to maintain that while doing robust enforcement.
Yeah. Well, my whole thing, and if you go back and were to listen to anything that I've ever said at a city council meeting, I really key in on the vagrancy part of our issue. And it goes back to the beginning when we talked about the fact that you can't paint the homeless with one stroke and the same paintbrush. There are different types of people. The vagrants are vagrants. They're here, and their sole purpose is to wreak as much havoc as possible. They don't care if they don't care what they're putting in their body, i.e. a illicit drug that could easily kill them. They have zero respect for anything else out in the community. Zero.
Absolutely.
And so, if we could somehow figure out a way to treat and offer the help to those that need it, and then separate the vagrant part of this population, just like you would anything else. I mean, if I went out there and did some type of crime, I am going to end up paying some type of price for that. It should be no different whether you have a roof over your head or a tent. So it almost feels to me that, especially I remember back in the injunction, the original injunction leading up to the Supreme Court case, it almost felt as if if you were a vagrant, all you had to do is get back to your camp, whether it be a park or wherever, and everything was fine. So you're welcome to go out and just commit as much crime as you possibly could. But boy, if you got back to that tent, it was hands off, and now we want to provide you 3 meals, and we want to give you clothing and a sleeping bag and anything else that you desire. And if you ended up deciding that you want to abandon that camp, just show back up and we'll refill that for you, and you can go about your business of vagrancy. We've got to be able to put a stop to that.
Yeah, I agree. This is so. Even if you didn't have the state picking up the ball and you had enforcement here, if they started enforcing the law as it pertains to the use of Schedule I drugs in the city of Grants Pass, and being right on top of criminal exploits and arresting and prosecuting these people, the population of the problem class of unhoused would drop dramatically.
Absolutely.
And the thing is that you see municipalities all over the state of Oregon and California and other cities in the country throwing millions of dollars at this current model of how to take care of the homeless situation. And it's the same as shooting it out of a cannon, basically turning this money into confetti. It's just, you're taking the people's money and you're just throwing it away. Now, I believe that people could really get behind, on a short-term basis. You take a larger amount of money, some of the money that, for instance, when they set up the J Street camp I remember that it was going to cost $500,000 to give garbage service to the J Street camp for like a 6-month period or something like that. If you put a few more officers on the street and paid for a few more prosecutions, you could dramatically lower the number of incidents in a very short period of time. Why is it that doesn't seem to be an objectively reasonable methodology?
That's a $1 million question. But what I would tell you, and to add to that, in my travels, meaning when I go out and visit, whether I'm driving back to South Carolina, I'm working my way back to Oregon, I'm paying attention to what other cities are doing. I worked my way back towards the west and I end up in Walla Walla, Washington. And as I'm driving through this city, I'm noticing that it was clean and beautiful. It was also a semi-conservative city, meaning it was very it was compatible to what we have here in Josephine County and Grants Pass. But they're also located in an extremely Democrat state. So they have issues they have to deal with. What they did was that city found a very strong nonprofit, and the city owned the land that this particular nonprofit is operating their shelter out of. What was interesting is the fact that the city is on the hook. So the city already had the land. They provide a security guard, and then they also provide the maintenance for everything within that site because it is still city property. There are rules, meaning that's one of the things that really drives me nuts about the term low barrier. Low barrier basically means that you're basically telling the vagrants in your community that you can go out and do the things that you want to do, and you can always come back and have a good night's rest if that's what they're trying to do, which, of course, the last thing they're doing is resting in these sites. But they come back, and as I mentioned, they get back to the camp, they can relax. It's pretty much off limits at that point, and then they go back and do their thing again. But in Walla Walla, I reached out to the director of this particular shelter, and they do not ask the city for any money. The city's provided them ample. As you can see, we're in the same position in Grants Pass is that we are being forced, because of HB3115, we are having to create some form of a shelter. Right now, we have 4 shelters that are considered low barrier in the middle of the city. That is absolutely unsustainable from any direction. So if we were to partner with a strong nonprofit and then create rules and regulations in regards to these shelters, because, as a person that RVs, when I pull into an RV park anywhere in this country, even in Oregon, they want to know a little bit about me. They want to know. And then the other thing they do is they hand me a sheet with rules on it. Well, if I have to follow rules as a taxpaying citizen, I would think that that's the least someone should do, especially if the city is providing, or should say a nonprofit is providing some form of services. I mean, they're getting meals, there's showers, there's all sorts of things that these folks have access to. And then what happens is those that choose, because we know that there is going to be part of that population, I think a pretty significant, maybe even 50% of that population of homeless, that are just going to refuse to even take part in that. Well, that's where the laws and the regulations come in. And so that part of the population is going to need to be held accountable. And if they want to continue to wreak havoc on our community, they're either going to pay the piper. Like, I know we're having a discussion right now, or at least the city has brought up this thing about having a municipal court. Well, the only way a municipal court is going to work is that there's going to have to be some type of requirements for those that have committed some type of crime or misdemeanor or whatever it is that they did that gets them into the misdemeanor court. They don't typically have the financial resources to do anything, but they have physical resources. They need to work. They need to be put to work in our community. They need to be forced, and when I say forced, they need to be required under supervision to clean up our city, because most of these folks have created that mess in the first place. I'm sure that after a few times of having to clean up under a supervision type of setting, perhaps they might move along to other pastures.
Yeah, and that's not a bad thing. I don't think that there's any problem with making it uncomfortable for the uncooperative to be here. You know, if you're not going to cooperate, if you're not going to obey the rules, as you mentioned with the RV parks, you have to obey the rules. Everyone, no one is above the law. Have we ever heard this before? Mm-hmm. No one is above the law, and they shouldn't be above the law. They should have the same impact for their actions and their conduct that we have. And that isn't happening right now. So you need the will, again, to do this sort of thing. And I got to tell you, in watching the meeting that we had last night, and this would be the May 19th meeting, city council meeting on the definitions of HB3115, that I don't see a whole lot of will coming from the city staff there. It is basically what to do to avoid getting sued again. And I don't know that playing it safe like that is how you get to a solution. I think these people need tough love. And listen, just like if you had an unruly teenager and they won't comply with the rules in your house, they can always leave and go somewhere else. And that's perfectly legitimate solution to the problem. And it's respectful of their own autonomy, you know. And we already have services in this city for those who will want to obey the rules and are mindful of moving up out of the unhoused circumstance. There's plenty of services here for people that want that. It's just that there aren't very many people that want that.
No. And I've said this, I go back a couple years ago. I think the nonprofits, in my opinion, have done somewhat of a disservice with some of the folks that are considered homeless in our community. For example, when I moved my family from Knoxville, Tennessee, we knew that we were ready to move out west. But where we moved out west had a lot to do with economics. You're not going to move from Knoxville, Tennessee to San Francisco, California, and making the same type of income and expecting the same type of lifestyle. And we keep hearing that Grants Pass is unaffordable. This is not the cheapest place in the world to live. And it's hard on folks that actually have a roof over their head. And yet we have these expectations that it is a housing crisis. That is the biggest excuse I've ever seen. Yeah. It is not a housing crisis. It is a crisis of reality, and that is perhaps the nonprofits should be sitting down with some folks and saying, have you thought about Mississippi? Have you thought about Louisiana? Have you thought about some of these other places? And that's exactly what I did when I moved my family from Knoxville to the west. I looked at California, but I pretty much ruled out every city there just because of economics. We ended up living in Cave Creek, Arizona, spent 23 years there, and then we found our way to Grants Pass. And of course, I am a financial advisor, so I do a little research as well when it comes to what's in the best interest of my family. And I'm not going to put anybody, especially my family, in jeopardy by moving somewhere that it's not economically viable. And so a lot of these folks, unless they have family here, and I think that's another and very important topic, and that is, are you from this area? And if you're not from this area, have you given any consideration into getting back to your family? Because that's going to be point number one. And if your family's not on that list, then maybe you think about moving somewhere that is a lot easier to live from a financial standpoint. You can live a pretty decent life in the Southeast. And I'm not just saying that to tell people to move. I'm saying this as a viable option. I mean, would you rather have a roof over your head or live in a tent?
But what's going on here is that you're making this argument from a perspective that they don't share with you. And the perspective of somebody who is in dire straits, who wants to exit that situation and be self-reliant and autonomous. And that's not a sentiment shared by these people.
No, it's not. But again, remember, the nonprofits know this as well. They're there to help people. And why would you want to keep someone in a situation where even if they were to get themselves back on the right track, and what I'm talking about is maybe they're no longer a drug addict. Maybe they've sought help, but yet this is still not the right place for them from an economic standpoint. So maybe have some honest conversations. Of course, the first subject, or the first thing, the most important thing, is to get them back into a healthy state of mind. They can work on the rest of the stuff later. But have honest conversations with them. Don't sugarcoat this thing. This is not the right place for a lot of people.
Yeah, and I think that in order to get somebody to that place, that they have to sort of rock bottom somehow, and that's where those choices are made. Mm-hmm. I just interviewed a gal, and I'm going to find a way to use this footage at some point if people are watching who know who I'm talking about. I interviewed this gal, and she said one of the best things that happened to her was she went to prison. She was drug addicted. She went to prison, and obviously you can't get drugs while maybe you can, but it's a lot harder to come by, and you dry out. And your thinking changes and your priorities change. And so I think personally, you have to get to a situation where there are mandatory treatment. Mandatory treatment or mandatory jail time, one of the two, both of which are going to accomplish the goal of drying somebody out.
Well, I think, too, using that exact model, because I personally think that that's an excellent model. I was actually speaking to someone this morning about that, and I was looking at this from more of a national crisis. And I actually recall President Trump mentioning doing something about the homeless, and it was along those same lines. The federal government owns more land in every state than anyone else. And there's no reason.
They own 67% of Josephine County.
So here's how I feel that they should approach it if I were the president. And that is, the homeless crisis is the equivalent of a Hurricane Katrina or any other natural disaster where it unsettles a lot of folks from their homes. But yet FEMA goes in and they set up these ginormous trailer communities. They put up these huge tents so that folks can get back on their feet. Why doesn't the federal government do the same thing and address they could do this in every single state. The homeless person doesn't necessarily care where they live.
Yeah. Well, the problem with that, we're going to watch a little piece of video here in a little bit that makes reference to what happens when you give the unhoused, the majority of the unhoused, a tiny home to live in, and what happens behind that. But unless you have some sort of a program in place where here are the steps that you're going to be involved, and you have to agree to this before we take you into our trailer city, in order to facilitate you getting out of it at some point and not just taking the infrastructure and flushing it down the toilet.
Well, to finish what I was saying, the way I would envision this is that the federal government would set up huge encampments. They have the resources. We don't have those resources. They would offer help to those that are ready for help. Those that don't want help or they want to continue that lifestyle, that's where the forced treatment comes in. In reality, what it really is it's reprogramming these people, because they have literally done so much damage to their system and to their brains that all they care about is to get that next fix, that next drug. They don't care about anything whatsoever. And so and I can tell you all sorts of success stories of people, even in my own family, where they were on a spiral, in my opinion, probably to death from drug addiction. But because they made some really bad judgments, they ended up getting arrested and went to prison. Prison saved their life. Not only did prison save their life, but prison, once they got out of prison, the state of Oregon offered a grant so that individual could go get their CDL training. And now that person is driving and is paying taxes, is living in a home, and is doing all the things that we would hope that we could do for this population.
Absolutely. That's the success story in that circumstance there. Continuing to make these people feel comfortable in their current circumstances is not helping them. You can make a pretty good case to suggest it's killing them.
They're enabling them to death.
So there's a Matt Walsh video that's going around. And, Matt Walsh, he's not from Grants Pass. He's from Nashville, Tennessee. So, but oddly, his perspective is somewhat similar. Here, let's
aside the very rare exceptions to this rule. In almost every case, it is someone who is unable and unwilling to do even the smallest, most basic things, to get even the lowest paying job and live in the most modest apartment. And also, they have systematically alienated every single person in their life. Mix all that together, that's how you end up with somebody on the street. And that's why you aren't going to solve the problem with cute little tiny homes. If you could, homelessness would not exist, because there are already small, unpleasant, and extremely cheap housing options in every city in the country. So, what is the solution? The only solution is to institutionalize. You start making use of prisons and asylums. We began closing the asylums in the middle of the last century in this country, in part because the pharmaceutical industry successfully pushed the claim, which we now know is false, that they can produce effective antipsychotic drugs. And now everyone admits that actually we have no idea how many of these drugs even work or if they work. We have no explanation for the dramatic rise in the number of mass shootings and suicides and so on. But despite these developments, no one's ever bothered to revisit the decision to close the asylums from the 1950s to the 1980s. Instead, activists are now seriously pushing the idea of tiny, tiny homes, even as every other tiny, tiny home becomes a storage locker for needles and dead animals. What these activists don't want to acknowledge, even though it's obviously true, is that you can't fix homelessness by building a giant cube in New York or a pop-up tent city in Portland or a tiny home in Toronto. The homeless population overwhelmingly is deeply troubled, mentally ill. They've dedicated their whole lives to drugs. It's the only thing they care about. And the way that they want to live is incompatible with civilization. Now, that's tragic, of course, but it's a lot more tragic to allow psychotic degenerates to destroy everyone else's quality of life. The fact that some people are incapable of living in a functional society doesn't mean that society needs more tiny, tiny homes. It means that these people need to be in an institution somewhere far away from the rest of us.
So that seems objectively reasonable to me.
I think it's extremely objectively reasonable. So yeah, again, how we get there, that's the big question. Is I agree everything that he just said.
But until you take a hard line on something and are willing to be immovable on the protection of the quiet enjoyment of people's own property,
yeah,
then this thing is going to continue, and it's going to congeal and metastasize, and it's the destruction of civilized living.
Yes. So you mentioned the word tough love earlier, and a parent, that's probably the hardest thing that they've ever had to do, would be to tell their child that you cannot live here anymore because it's destructive, and you're not just affecting yourself, you're affecting everyone around you.
I know such parents.
Well, my wife is one of those, where we were those parents. But tough love needs to also be utilized by the community and by the city. And that's exactly what is needed in the city of Grants Pass. We need to be tough. We need to offer tough love to those that are here, that are not here to benefit not only themselves, but the community around them. And, unless something drastically happens, my guess is the population of Grants Pass is going to slowly start going in the opposite direction. And you're going to see more and more businesses shutter, because no one is going to want to come to Grants Pass and hang out knowing that we have an uncontrolled population of drug addicts and vagrants that are roaming the streets, and they're getting all the rest that they need in 4, 5, I don't know, what's the next number, 10 low barrier shelters. There's got to be some type of end to this particular nightmare.
Absolutely. And I think that this has done a great deal to educate people when they finally do give up on Grants Pass and sell their home for whatever they can get for it and move to some other place. They may do a little investigation as to how this issue is being dealt with on their prospective new home.
Yes. I've even made this recommendation to our city, and that is, why not reach out to other communities that have somehow figured out, there's no such thing as a perfect solution, but there is much better solutions than what we have going on within the city of Grants Pass. So instead of trying to reinvent the wheel, pick up the phone, call the city manager of Walla Walla, call the city manager in Ashland. Ashland's not my favorite place to go, just because I don't agree with some of the politics down in Ashland. But I can tell you that Ashland has somehow figured out their homeless situation to a point where my wife and I went down there for Mother's Day to visit our son and his girlfriend, and I probably didn't see one homeless person the whole time I was there. The parks were packed full of people enjoying them, and it was the complete opposite scene when we got back to Grants Pass. And so it caused me to want to reach out to the city of Ashland, and what I have found is that, again, very much like Walla Walla, but under Oregon law, because Walla Walla doesn't have HB or anything like HB3115. Washington State has tried to do that, but they were able to shoot it down. And they think that they're going to come back with it again. But Ashland has several nonprofits that operate independently of the city. Then they have one, I would call it an overflow camp, and it's located next to the police station. That overflow camp, they cannot set up a tent until 7 p.m. And then at 7 a.m., they have to have all of their stuff out of there. So if the city of Ashland...
Seems reasonable.
Well, I think it seems What's the?
Objectively
I think
reasonable.
it seems
Yes.
objectively reasonable
Yes.
that if Ashland can do what they're doing, surely Grants Pass can figure out a pathway to that as well.
I think that there are ways to make it work inside the framework that we have, but I think that this is going to take an initiative process. You could put an initiative process into motion and put this on the ballot, and I think that it would pass overwhelmingly in the state of Oregon, especially with people who understand what's coming their way if it hasn't come to their town already. Cities need the autonomy to deal with this in their own way.
Yes, it's pretty, and that's the other frustrating part of this, that it's sad to know that the city of Grants Pass, being I would call it the epicenter of the homeless crisis in the United States, even though we're only a population of 40,000 people, we were the city that took this case all the way to the Supreme Court, and we won. And yet we are handcuffed once again, and every city, including the cities in Oregon, are actually using our efforts to benefit their community. Yeah. And yet we are still behind the 8 ball.
Right. And we paid the money for this litigation.
Yes.
Yeah, it's unfortunate. Listen, I appreciate you coming in and talking to me. It gives people a little bit more space to understand who somebody is, other than the 3 minutes that you see him at almost every city council meeting. And I appreciate you coming in, Mike.
You're welcome. Thank you. You do a great job.
Thank you, sir.